Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can discuss the counseling scenes from the movie Good Will Hunting and give my thoughts on the movie overall. So with Good Will Hunting, we see this is a 1997 movie that involves a janitor, Will Hunting, who has an incredible mathematical talent. This character is played by Matt Damon. We also see a therapist, specifically a psychologist in this movie, named Sean Maguire. He's played by Robin Williams. Will is treated several times throughout the movie by Sean, and the relationship is really considered to be the most redeeming and interesting part of the film. A lot of things happen in this movie. I'll be focusing here again on the counseling scenes. A number of counselors and clients being treated by counselors have strong opinions about this movie and specifically about the counseling scenes in the movie. Some people believe that the movie really captures the essence of counseling. Others believe that it's one of the worst things that could have happened to the counseling profession. And still others believe that even with the ethical problems that we see all throughout the counseling scenes with Sean's behavior, much can be learned from the therapy scenes in this film. I'll provide my opinion on this point a little later in the video. Now, one interesting point here, we see that some people say that Robin Williams' character, Sean Maguire, destroyed a generation of counselors. I've heard this a few times. It didn't, but I understand their point. I've also heard the same thing about Robin Williams in Dead Poets Society, basically saying that he was too emotionally driven, right, the character he plays. This was actually something I saw on The Simpsons, but I've also heard people say it when talking about that movie. So we have kind of a parallel there. Also, Patch Adams, Robin Williams played that character in that movie. His performance was characterized as not being serious enough, although I think that was kind of the point of that movie. And we could also say the same thing about a movie like Mrs. Doubtfire. He was playing a nanny, but he was really an imposter, right? So we see that Robin Williams seems to be attracted to playing roles that were not well received by members of the profession being represented. Just a thought that I had there. So I mentioned here in Good Will Hunting the focus on the counseling scenes. We see the stage is set here as Will fails to connect with several therapists before he meets Sean Maguire. So really there's this idea that there's some sense of desperation to find Will a good therapist. Now, the scene with the first session is often remembered by the famous line said by Sean to Will. And he said, "I will end you." This is toward the end of the session. This session takes place with both individuals standing for the last part of the session as things get a little bit more heated. In the scene, we see that Will tries to aggravate Sean repeatedly, criticizing the fact that Sean's office is full of books, criticizing Sean's painting of a small boat, trying to analyze Sean in a way that perhaps Will believes Sean is going to do with him, right? He's trying to turn the tables. Will tries to break down the meaning of the small boat in the painting by suggesting that Sean is frightened and vulnerable. Now, throughout this scene, we see that Sean attempts to endure the insults without reacting in an unhelpful way. But then we see that Will really takes things too far. He wanders into the area of Sean's marital relationship. Now, in a normal counseling session, this wouldn't be too far, but it's too far for the character Sean in this film. So we see that Will suggests that perhaps Sean married the wrong woman. Then we see this vigorous and aggressive response from Sean. After a short amount of dialogue, Sean grabs Will by the throat and pushes him back, explaining to Will that if he ever disrespects his wife again, he will end him. So again, we see this famous line, "I will end you." We see later on in a scene that takes place by a lake, in what only can be loosely described as a counseling session, Sean explains how Will doesn't really know anything about life, and goes on for a while about his own experience of losing his wife, strongly blurring the counselor-client relationship. It seems like a lot of emphasis is put on the resolution of Sean's problem, the loss of his wife and coping with that, as much as it is on helping Will. After that, we see a session where Will is silent for the whole time as Will tries to establish power and prove that he's still in control of the relationship. Later on, in a more traditional session, we see the relationship develop a little more authentically and realistically, but again, Sean's talking about his own experiences with his wife and not really attending to Will. Then we see another session where it seems like it's kind of traditional, but Will is really trying to counsel Sean. It looks like there's going to be a role reversal, but Sean manages to connect over the concept of regret. Then we see a session where Sean tries to challenge Will a little bit more. So he tells Will that Will's only seeing things negatively. We also see more self-disclosure from Sean, which of course wasn't really necessary here in the scene, but it's there. We see that Sean challenges Will about his choices in life and then kicks him out of the session, telling him that playtime is over. And the reason he kicks him out is because he feels like Will isn't answering his questions. He isn't being authentic. Of course, this is problematic, but again, that's what we see in this scene. Then we see the most dramatic session, and this is the one that a lot of people talk about when they talk about counseling in this movie. We see that in this particular session, both were standing the entire time. Sean has a file that details the abuse that Will endured when Will was younger. Sean again talks about his own history, which shouldn't be surprising by this point in the movie because we've seen so much of that, and tells Will that all the things that happened to Will were not Will's fault. This line, "It's not your fault," is really the most memorable in the scene and arguably the most memorable line in the entire movie. Now, in the last encounter, which I'm not really sure qualifies as a session, we see that they wrap things up in a predictable way. Will gets something from the relationship, and we also see that Sean gets something from the relationship as well. So they're really both kind of unlocked and able to move forward in their lives. So were the counseling scenes in this movie helpful? Can we really learn something from seeing therapy that was performed in such an unethical manner? I have a few thoughts about these scenes. The content of these scenes, especially the "it's not your fault" scene, really seems to resonate with a lot of people. The scene has had an impact on thousands of people who find their situation similar in some way to that of the Will Hunting character, and there's something to be said for that. I've heard more about the specific scene, and in particular that line, "it's not your fault," than I have about other famous counseling scenes from the movies and television. For example, it's more popular than the therapy we see in The Sopranos. It's more popular than the therapy we see in Ordinary People. I'll come back to the impact of this particular line in a few moments. Next, these scenes are unrealistic and not necessarily insightful. The resonating quality and the learning opportunities aside, any therapist who regularly or even occasionally behaved would definitely run into legal and ethical problems that would eventually result in their ability to practice being removed. This is crystal clear in the first scene, the "I will end you" scene. Physically assaulting a client is understandably frowned upon. Even touching a client in an aggressive way would likely be a career-ending move. But grabbing the client's throat and pushing them while issuing a death threat, this is so over the top that it makes the scene and really the whole movie kind of unbelievable. Sean's extreme reaction wasn't even necessary to make the point of that scene. It just served to erode the realism. I could understand this scene if the point was to portray Sean as a dangerous and unqualified therapist, but that wasn't the point. He was supposed to be a good therapist. He was supposed to be different and creative and moving away from the mainstream, somebody that could connect with somebody as unusual as Will, right? That was the idea. They were both special. Now, the middle sessions were a little closer to traditional therapy, although there was much more confrontation than we would usually expect to see in counseling. Important issues were touched upon, though, like relationships, choosing a direction in life, and recognizing opportunity. As for the "it's not your fault" scene, well, certainly this one is closer to ethical than the "I will end you" scene, right? Because that one wasn't even close. But there are still some serious problems here with this scene. Closing the physical distance while repeating the same thing to a client is not a therapeutic technique. Therapeutically speaking, it's simplistic, it does not respect the autonomy of the client, and it's dangerous. Now, the embrace itself between Sean and Will, which was a powerful part of the film, this is not necessarily unethical. This can happen in a real session, but it happened here because, again, that distance was closed by Sean. He continued to get closer, and he initiated the embrace between them. Furthermore, we see that Will physically pushes Sean away. He hits Sean in the chest, and Sean keeps on approaching, right? So that's really problematic. Also in the scene, the therapy takes place with both characters standing. This isn't really realistic. I imagine the scene was written this way to allow Sean to close that distance for that dramatic effect. Standing, of course, in a session is not unethical. but it's just, again, kind of unusual. So with all this commentary about ethics aside, why did the statement, "It's not your fault," resonate with so many people? If I counted correctly, Sean repeats this one line 10 times. I believe it's this precise line, these 4 words, that really connect with people much more than the other content we see in this movie. Well, in this movie, Will Hunting is the victim of trauma. Specifically, he was assaulted by his father repeatedly. It's not unusual for people who experience this to blame themselves. So there's something really powerful and genuine about finally releasing oneself from culpability for a situation like this, or being released by someone else, like Sean releasing Will. Will really needed to hear the acknowledgement that the abuse did not reflect something wrong with him. I think the strong reaction to this particular line underscores how common this sentiment is. Many people who have experienced trauma feel guilt that is not warranted by the circumstances. And among the other things they might desire, they want others to recognize that they were not guilty and to say it for them when they can't say it for themselves, to believe it for them when they can't fully believe it for themselves, to see the best in them without having to be told to see the best in them. That's what's really happening in this scene. That's what it really captured so well. Will Hunting doesn't ask Sean to say this. He doesn't have to ask if what he experienced was his fault, but he still shows Sean that he needs that affirmation. And this is what Sean picks up on and reacts to. So with all the good and bad in the counseling portions of this movie, what can we take away from a counseling perspective? Well, I think it's important to understand the difference between actual counseling and what it looks like when it's portrayed in the movies. It's hard to think of one profession that likes the way that they are represented in films, and the counseling profession is no exception. Even still, I think there's a lot to be learned here, mostly from the mistakes that we see that Sean makes in the sessions, but also from some of his appropriate moves. So taking a look at both sides of this, we see Will's character comes off as defensive and narcissistic, and this can have a negative effect on counselors. As I mentioned, the expected reaction would not be strangulation like we saw in this movie, but certainly counselors can be affected by insults, and learning not to be affected is actually a pretty important skill. We see examples here of a counselor who's talking too much and sharing his personal stories in a way that are inappropriate. Self-disclosure is a legitimate technique. It's not one that I find very useful as a counselor, but technically it's not unethical. I think the important takeaway here, though, from what we see in these scenes, is that a counselor should avoid self-disclosure. We see the importance of counselors successfully resolving key incidents in their own lives so they don't bring that material into the session. Again, it would seem that Sean is talking about the relationship he had with his wife more than he's talking about Will's problems. Counseling is never about a counselor meeting their own needs. It's always focused on the needs of the client. The last lesson I think we can learn here is the power of affirmation. The "it's not your fault" line, I don't agree with the way it was done in this film. That's not real life, but it still came across as quite powerful. In one sense, I think what can be learned here is that counselors need to be aware of what a client is communicating at many levels, more than just what is being communicated with words. The counselor needs to look at the entire presentation, verbal, nonverbal, the history, everything, and try to see things from the client's point of view. If the counselor can do that, there can be powerful and profound statements of affirmation. Although, of course, most of the good done in therapy doesn't come from these few moments. This is really more just for the movies. So what about this movie as a whole? Was it a good film? I definitely can see how people would like this movie. I don't think it was a bad movie, but the counseling scenes did not really look like real therapy. The movie essentially was supposed to be about someone who received good therapy, so there's a real disconnect there I see here when looking at this film. Also, some of the devices in the movie I thought were lazy. The separation from Skylar, then pursuing her again. I know there's only so many ways to tell stories and only so many stories to tell, but this seemed kind of worn out, even in 1997. We also see the young, troubled person that is too smart for the average counselor. He needs an unethical counselor to put him on the right path. This is also kind of worn out. So, again, I understand the number of devices are limited, but I didn't really like the way they were used here in this film. I don't usually like movies that are based on dialogue with no action, so with nothing else happening. So I think part of the reason that I'm not necessarily a big fan of this movie has to do with that style we see in this film. And I don't like movies that try to display a good therapeutic relationship by showing us a bad one. So it's worth watching. I think it had some great moments and some great learning opportunities, but overall, I don't think it was really my kind of movie. So there are my thoughts on the counseling scenes and the movie in general. I know whenever I talk about topics like these, there will be a variety of opinions. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate a really interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found this analysis of Good Will Hunting to be interesting. Thanks for watching.